bold opening. Imagine waking up in a country that's celebrating a century of freedom, but beneath the fireworks and parades, there's a story that most of the world has forgotten, a story that didn't just change one nation, but sent shockwaves across continents. This year, Turkey marks 100 years since it broke free from the chains of its past. But this wasn't just another Independence Day. It was the day an empire that had ruled for centuries vanished overnight. And with it, a system that had shaped the lives of millions for over 1,000 years was erased from the map 100 years ago. In 1923, the world was still reeling from the devastation of World War I. Borders were being redrawn, empires were collapsing, and new nations were rising from the ashes. But while most countries were fighting to escape the grip of European colonial powers like Britain, France, or Italy, Turkey's struggle was different. Its battle wasn't against a foreign invader, but against its own ancient rulers, the mighty Ottoman Caliphate. For over 6 centuries, the Ottomans had been the undisputed leaders of the Muslim world, their sultans commanding respect and fear from Europe to Africa and deep into Asia. Their empire stretched across 3 continents, and their word was law in lands that had never even heard of London or Paris. But in the chaos that followed the Great War, everything changed. The last Ottoman Caliph, Sultan Abdülmecid II, was forced to pack his bags and leave the only home his family had known for generations. He wasn't just leaving a palace, he was leaving behind a legacy that had lasted for 1,300 years. The Caliphate, once the beating heart of the Islamic world, was suddenly gone. And it wasn't just Turkey that felt the impact. Across the globe, millions of Muslims woke up to a world where, for the first time in centuries, there was no caliph to unite them, no sultan to lead them, and no empire to protect them. The day the caliphate ended, the world changed in ways that are still being felt a century later. Some saw it as a new beginning, a chance for Turkey to reinvent itself as a modern, secular nation. Others saw it as a tragedy, the loss of a system that had given meaning and unity to generations. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And as Turkey celebrates its 100th year, the echoes of that fateful day still haunt its streets, its politics, and its people. But how did it all happen? And what secrets lie buried beneath the surface of this historic transformation? The answers might surprise you. The unique path to Turkish independence. When most people think of independence, they picture a nation breaking free from the grip of a foreign empire, flags coming down, new leaders rising, and a sense of unity in the face of a common enemy. But Turkey's story was nothing like that. In fact, it was almost the opposite. While countries across Asia and Africa were fighting to escape the control of European powers, Turkey's battle was an internal revolution, a dramatic showdown between the old world and the new. The enemy wasn't a distant king or a foreign army, but a centuries-old dynasty that had ruled from within, one that had become both the pride and the prison of its people. The Ottoman Caliphate wasn't just another monarchy. For over 600 years, it had been the spiritual and political center of the Muslim world. Its sultans were more than just kings, they were caliphs, seen by millions as the rightful successors to the Prophet Muhammad, and the ultimate authority for Muslims everywhere. Their word carried weight from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans. But by the early 20th century, the world was changing fast, and the empire that had once seemed invincible was now crumbling under its own weight. The Ottomans had lost territory, power, and the loyalty of many of their subjects. The world outside was moving forward, but inside the empire, time seemed to stand still. As the dust settled after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its vast lands had been carved up by the victors, and its people were left to pick up the pieces. But even in defeat, the Caliphate still held a powerful grip on the hearts and minds of millions. For many, the idea of a world without a caliph was unthinkable. The caliph was more than a ruler. He was a symbol of unity, a living link to a glorious past. But for a new generation of Turkish leaders, that past was holding the country back. They saw the caliphate as a relic, a chain that kept Turkey tied to old traditions and prevented it from joining the modern world. Enter Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, a soldier, a visionary, and a man determined to drag Turkey into the future, no matter the cost. Ataturk believed that for Turkey to survive, it had to break free from the shadow of the Ottomans. He saw the caliphate as a threat to national unity, a source of division that could tear the country apart. So, in a move that stunned the world, he abolished the caliphate, exiled the last caliph and his family, and set out to build a new Turkey from the ground up. It was a decision that sent shockwaves far beyond the country's borders. Across the Muslim world, people mourned the loss of their spiritual leader. In Turkey, the reaction was mixed. Some cheered the birth of a new nation, while others grieved the end of an era. But the story didn't end there. The exile of the last Caliph, Abdülmecid II, wasn't just a political act, it was a cultural earthquake. The Ottoman family, once the most powerful dynasty in the Muslim world, was suddenly homeless, scattered across Europe and the Middle East. Their palaces were seized, their titles stripped, and their legacy thrown into question. For the first time in centuries, there was no caliph to unite the world's Muslims, no sultan to command armies, and no empire to inspire fear or respect. The world had changed overnight, and Turkey was at the center of it all. But what kind of nation would rise from the ashes of the caliphate? And what secrets did the Ottomans leave behind as they vanished into history? The answers would shape not just Turkey, but the entire world for generations to come. Origins of the Ottoman Empire. Long before the world knew the name Turkey, the land that now forms its heart was a crossroads of empires, cultures, and civilizations. But the people we now call Turks didn't even originate here. Their story begins far to the east, in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, place of endless horizons, fierce tribes, and ancient rivalries. These early Turks were nomads, skilled horsemen who roamed the grasslands between what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. For centuries, they lived on the fringes of great empires, overshadowed by the mighty Persians, Greeks, and Romans. In the grand sweep of history, the Turks were little more than a footnote until everything changed. The turning point came with the arrival of Islam. As the new faith spread across the Middle East, it began to reshape the destinies of entire peoples. The Turks, once outsiders, found themselves drawn into the orbit of the Islamic world. It was a slow transformation, but a profound one. The first Turkish tribes to embrace Islam did so not just out of faith, but out of opportunity. The Islamic empires of the time were expanding rapidly, and they needed warriors fierce, loyal, and skilled in battle. The Turks fit the bill perfectly. Over time, they rose from mercenaries to military leaders, and eventually, to rulers in their own right. One of the earliest and most influential Turkish dynasties was led by a chieftain named Seljuk. His descendants carved out a powerful state that stretched from Central Asia deep into the heart of Anatolia, the land that would one day become Turkey. The Seljuks were not just conquerors, they were builders, patrons of art and science, and defenders of the Islamic faith. But even as they rose to power, they remained outsiders in many ways. The true spiritual authority in the Muslim world still rested with the Arab caliphs in Baghdad, and the Seljuk rulers were content to call themselves sultans, not caliphs. But history has a way of favoring the bold. As the Seljuk Empire began to fragment, new Turkish tribes pushed ever further west, drawn by the promise of land and glory. Among these was a small, relatively obscure clan led by a man named Osman. Little is known for certain about Osman's early life, but what is clear is that his descendants would go on to achieve what no other Turkish tribe had ever dreamed of. They would build an empire that would last for centuries and dominate 3 continents. The Ottomans, as they came to be known, started with a tiny patch of land on the edge of the crumbling Byzantine Empire, but through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer determination, they expanded their domain year after year. The rise of the Ottomans was anything but inevitable. They faced constant threats from rival tribes, hostile neighbors, and the ever-present danger of internal strife. Yet, time and again, they managed to survive and even thrive, turning setbacks into opportunities and enemies into allies. Their story is one of resilience, ambition, and a relentless drive to carve out a place in a world that had long ignored them. By the time the rest of the world began to take notice, the Ottomans were already on the march, poised to change the course of history forever. But what was it about the Ottomans that set them apart from the countless other tribes and dynasties that had risen and fallen before them? And how did a small band of warriors from the steppes of Central Asia come to rule over a vast and diverse empire? The answers lie in the next chapter of their incredible journey, a chapter filled with ambition, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of power. And, as the Ottomans began to expand, the world would soon realize that a new force had arrived, one that would leave an indelible mark on history. The Golden Age and transformation. As the Ottomans carved out their place in history, They weren't just building an empire, they were stepping into a world already shaped by centuries of Islamic civilization. Before the Ottomans ever dreamed of ruling from Istanbul, the Muslim world had experienced a golden age under the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, was once the beating heart of global knowledge, culture, and innovation. It was a city where scholars from every corner of the world gathered to share ideas, translate ancient texts, and push the boundaries of science, medicine, and philosophy. The Abbasids had created a society where learning was celebrated, and their influence stretched far beyond the borders of their empire. But even the greatest empires are not immune to decline. As the Abbasids weakened, new powers rose to fill the void. The Seljuks, and later the Ottomans, inherited not just territory but also the legacy of this golden age. The Ottomans, in particular, were determined to prove themselves worthy of this inheritance. They saw themselves as both protectors and innovators, guardians of tradition, but also pioneers ready to shape the future. Their rise was marked by a unique blend of ambition and adaptability. They absorbed the best of the cultures they conquered, blending Turkish, Arab, Persian, and Byzantine influences into something entirely new. The transformation of the Ottomans from a small Anatolian principality into a global superpower was nothing short of extraordinary. Their military campaigns were relentless, and their political strategies were often ruthless, but what truly set them apart was their ability to adapt. They learned from their rivals, adopted new technologies, and welcomed talented people from across their vast empire. This openness fueled a period of remarkable growth and prosperity. Cities like Bursa, Edirne, and eventually Istanbul became centers of trade, art, and learning. The Ottomans built grand mosques, bustling markets, and palaces that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. Yet, for all their power, the Ottomans were still seen as outsiders by many in the Muslim world. The title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of all Muslims, remained in the hands of the Abbasids. Even as their political power faded, the Ottomans, for generations, were content to rule as sultans, focusing on expanding their territory and consolidating their rule. But history, as always, had other plans. In 1517, after a series of dramatic events, Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt and brought the last Abbasid Caliph to Istanbul. In a moment that would change the course of Islamic history, the caliphate was transferred from the Arabs to the Turks. For the first time, the Ottoman Sultan was also recognized as the Caliph, uniting spiritual and temporal power in a single hand. This transformation was more than just a change in titles. It marked the beginning of a new era, not just for the Ottomans, but for the entire Muslim world. The Ottoman caliphs became symbols of unity and strength, their authority stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the cities of Europe. Under their rule, the empire reached its zenith, becoming the most powerful state in the world. Their armies marched across continents, their fleets dominated the seas, and their influence shaped the destinies of millions. But with great power came great challenges. The Ottomans now carried the weight of both empire and faith, and the expectations of their subjects were higher than ever. They were no longer just conquerors, they were the stewards of a civilization, responsible for upholding justice, fostering knowledge, and defending the faith. The golden age of the Ottomans was a time of incredible achievement, but it was also a period of mounting pressure. The world was changing, and the Ottomans would soon face tests that would push them to their limits. What happened next would determine not just the fate of an empire, but the future of an entire civilization. The peak and the turning point. At the height of their power, the Ottomans stood as the world's most formidable empire. Their banners flew over lands stretching from the heart of Europe to the deserts of Arabia, and their influence reached into Africa and deep into Asia. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was more than just a military victory, it was a seismic event that echoed across continents. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the new capital and a symbol of Ottoman ambition. For centuries, Constantinople had been the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, a city thought to be but Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, shattered that illusion. His victory fulfilled a prophecy that had lingered in the Muslim world for generations, and it sent a clear message. A new era had begun. With the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans didn't just inherit a city, they inherited a legacy. Istanbul became a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ideas. The Ottomans welcomed scholars, artists, and merchants from across their vast territories, turning the city into a vibrant hub of innovation and exchange. The empire's reach extended into the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East, and its armies became a force that even the most powerful European monarchs feared. The Ottomans were no longer just regional players. They were a global superpower, shaping the fate of nations and the course of history. But with every peak comes a turning point. The very success that had propelled the Ottomans to greatness began to sow the seeds of future challenges. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to govern such a vast and diverse realm. The sultans relied on a complex system of administration, but cracks began to appear. Local rulers grew more powerful, corruption crept into the bureaucracy, and rival factions vied for influence at court. The once unified empire started to show signs of strain. Meanwhile, the world outside was changing at a dizzying pace. In Europe, the Renaissance was sparking a revolution in art, science, and technology. New ideas were spreading, and new powers were rising. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492 opened up vast new sources of wealth for European nations, shifting the balance of power. Suddenly, the Ottomans found themselves facing rivals who were richer, more innovative, and increasingly bold. Inside the empire, the challenges were just as daunting. The Ottomans had always prided themselves on their ability to adapt, but now, tradition began to clash with the demands of a modern world. The sultans faced pressure to reform, but every change risked upsetting the delicate balance that held the empire together. Some rulers tried to modernize the military, others sought to centralize power, but resistance was fierce. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the Ottoman army, became a powerful and often unruly force, more interested in their own privileges than in defending the empire. Yet, even as these challenges mounted, the Ottomans continued to project an image of strength. The sultans still claimed the title of Caliph, and their words still carried weight across the Muslim world. But beneath the surface, the empire was changing. The transfer of the Caliphate from the Arabs to the Turks had united spiritual and political authority, but it also placed enormous pressure on the sultans to live up to impossible expectations. They were expected to be both conquerors and caretakers, warriors and wise men, defenders of the faith and masters of a sprawling, multicultural empire. The peak of Ottoman power was a time of glory, but it was also the beginning of a long and complicated decline. The world was moving forward, and the Ottomans would soon face challenges that no amount of tradition or military might could overcome. The turning point had arrived, and the choices made in the years that followed would determine the fate of the empire and the future of Turkey itself. But what exactly went wrong, and how did the world's greatest empire begin to unravel from within? The answers reveal a story of ambition, intrigue, and the relentless march of history. Seeds of decline for centuries, the Ottoman Empire seemed unstoppable. But even the mightiest empires are not immune to the slow creep of decline. The seeds of the Ottomans' downfall were sown not just on the battlefield, but deep within the palace walls and the very fabric of society. As the empire reached its zenith, cracks began to upper cracks that would eventually widen into chasms, pulling the once great empire toward its inevitable collapse. One of the most unexpected sources of turmoil came from within the royal harem itself. The sultan's wives and concubines, many of whom were brought from distant lands like Ukraine, Greece, and the Balkans, began to wield unprecedented influence over the throne. This era, often called the Sultanate of Women, saw powerful queens and mothers shaping the fate of the empire from behind the scenes. Some, like Kaiksem Sultan, became legendary for their cunning and ambition, even rumored to have orchestrated the rise and fall of sultans to secure their own power. These palace intrigues led to bitter rivalries, assassinations, and a climate of suspicion that weakened the unity of the royal family and distracted the sultans from the challenges facing their empire. But the problems didn't stop at the palace gates. As Europe surged ahead with new inventions and ideas, the Ottomans found themselves falling behind. One of the most damaging decisions came with the arrival of the printing press. While Europe embraced this revolutionary technology, spreading knowledge and literacy at an unprecedented rate, Ottoman officials and religious leaders declared it forbidden. For nearly 2 centuries, the printing press was banned in the empire, stifling the spread of new ideas and leaving the population dependent on slow hand-copied manuscripts. By the time the ban was finally lifted, Europe had raced far ahead, and the Ottomans were left struggling to catch up. Corruption and complacency also took root in the empire's vast bureaucracy. Local governors, once loyal servants of the Sultan, began to act as independent rulers, collecting taxes for themselves and ignoring orders from Istanbul. The Janissaries, the elite military corps that had once been the backbone of Ottoman power, grew increasingly unruly and resistant to change. Instead of defending the empire, they became a political force, often deposing sultans who threatened their privileges. The once disciplined army became a source of instability, and military defeats began to pile up. Meanwhile, the world outside the empire was changing at a dizzying pace. European nations, enriched by trade and colonial conquests, developed powerful new weapons and strategies. The Ottomans, clinging to old ways, found themselves outmatched on the battlefield and outmaneuvered in diplomacy. The empire's vast size, once its greatest strength, became a liability as communication and control broke down across distant provinces. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from within. As the Ottomans struggled to adapt, a sense of stagnation and fatalism set in. The empire that had once been a beacon of innovation and tolerance became increasingly rigid and suspicious of change. Reformers who tried to modernize the state were often met with fierce resistance, both from conservative officials and from those who feared losing their power. The result was a cycle of half-hearted reforms and crushing setbacks, each one eroding the foundations of the empire a little more. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its lands had been carved up by rival powers, its people were restless, and its leaders seemed powerless to stop the decline. The seeds of downfall, planted over centuries, had finally borne bitter fruit. But the final act of this epic drama was yet to come, a series of events that would not only end the Ottoman Empire, but change the course of history for Turkey and the entire Muslim world. And what happened next would shock everyone. Collapse and controversy. As the 20th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire was teetering on the edge. Decades of internal decay, military defeats, and lost territories had left the once mighty state battered and vulnerable. But it was the outbreak of World War I that delivered the final, crushing blow. The Ottomans, desperate to reclaim their former glory, made a fateful decision to side with Germany and the Central Powers. It was a gamble that would prove disastrous. As the war dragged on, Ottoman forces suffered defeat after defeat, and the empire's already fragile grip on its provinces began to slip away. The end of the war brought not peace, but chaos. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, and the empire's remaining lands were carved up by victorious European powers. In the Arab world, long-standing resentment against Ottoman rule boiled over, with many Arab leaders siding with the British in hopes of gaining independence. The dream of a united Muslim world under the Caliph's banner was shattered, replaced by a patchwork of new nations and colonial mandates. The Ottoman sultans, once the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, found themselves powerless, their authority reduced to little more than a memory. But the most dramatic changes were yet to come. In the heart of Anatolia, a new movement was rising, one that would sweep away the last remnants of the old order and reshape Turkey forever. Led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a charismatic and determined military leader, the Turkish War of Independence erupted. Ataturk and his followers rejected the Sultan's authority, denouncing the old regime as corrupt and out of touch. They envisioned a new Turkey, modern, secular, and free from the burdens of empire. In 1922, the Sultanate was officially abolished, and Sultan Mehmed VI was forced into exile. But Ataturk wasn't finished. The following year, he took the unprecedented step of abolishing the Caliphate itself, sending the last Caliph, Abdülmecid II, and his family into permanent exile. This act sent shockwaves throughout the Muslim world. For centuries, the Caliph had been a symbol of unity and spiritual leadership for Muslims everywhere. Now, for the first time in over a millennium, there was no Caliph, no Sultan, and no empire. Ataturk's reforms didn't stop with the abolition of the Caliphate. Determined to break with the past, he launched a sweeping campaign to modernize and secularize Turkish society. The Arabic script was replaced with a Latin-based alphabet, religious schools were closed, and Islamic law was replaced with secular codes. Even the call to prayer was required to be recited in Turkish instead of Arabic, a move that sparked outrage among many devout Muslims. Ataturk's vision was clear. Turkey would be a nation rooted in Western ideals, not Ottoman traditions. These radical changes were met with fierce resistance. Many Turks mourned the loss of their heritage and struggled to adapt to the new order. Across the Muslim world, the abolition of the Caliphate was seen as a catastrophe, a sign that the unity of the Ummah had been shattered. Rumors and conspiracy theories swirled, with some claiming that foreign powers had orchestrated the fall of the Caliphate to weaken Islam. Others saw Ataturk as a hero, a visionary who had saved Turkey from destruction and set it on a path to progress. The controversy surrounding the end of the Ottoman Empire and the birth of modern Turkey continues to this day. Some celebrate Ataturk's legacy as the founder of a strong, independent nation. Others mourn the loss of the Caliphate and the traditions that were swept away in the name of progress. But one thing is certain: the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter for Turkey and the entire Muslim world. And as the dust settled, the world was left to wonder what would rise from the ashes of the empire, and what secrets had been buried with its fall. The answers, as always, would prove to be more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Aftermath and modern ethos. The fall of the Ottoman Caliphate didn't just redraw borders, it rewrote the very identity of Turkey and sent ripples across the entire Muslim world. In the years that followed, the new Turkish Republic, under Ataturk's iron-willed leadership, embarked on a radical transformation that would leave the country almost unrecognizable to those who remembered the days of sultans and caliphs. The reforms were sweeping, sometimes shocking, and often deeply controversial. Ataturk's vision was to create a nation that looked to the future, not the past, a country that would stand shoulder to shoulder with the modern powers of Europe, rather than clinging to the traditions of a fallen empire. One of the most dramatic changes was the shift from Arabic to the Latin alphabet. Overnight, millions of Turks found themselves unable to read or write in their own language, as the old script was replaced with new letters. The intention was to break with the Ottoman past and make literacy more accessible, but the result was a cultural rupture that left generations feeling disconnected from their own history. Ancient manuscripts, poetry, and family records became unreadable relics, and the link to centuries of Ottoman heritage was suddenly severed. Ataturk's reforms didn't stop at language. He banned traditional Ottoman clothing, encouraged Western dress, and even outlawed the fez, symbol of the old order. Religious schools were closed, and the influence of Islamic scholars was sharply curtailed. The call to prayer, once recited in the melodious tones of Arabic, was now required to be delivered in Turkish. For nearly 2 decades, the sound of the muezzin's voice in Istanbul's mosques was a daily reminder of the new order. Even the role of women in society was transformed, with new rights and freedoms that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. But these changes came at a cost. Many Turks felt lost in the rush to modernize, torn between pride in their new nation and nostalgia for the world they had left behind. The descendants of the Ottoman royal family, once the most powerful dynasty in the Muslim world, were scattered across Europe and the Middle East, living in quiet exile. Their palaces were turned into museums, their titles stripped away, and their stories reduced to footnotes in history books. Yet, even in exile, the memory of the Caliphate lingered, symbol of unity and faith that many still longed for. Across the Muslim world, the abolition of the Caliphate left a void that has never truly been filled. For centuries, the Caliph had been a rallying point, a figure who could unite diverse peoples under a single banner. In the decades that followed, various movements and leaders would try to claim that mantle, but none would succeed in restoring the authority or legitimacy of the old caliphs. Rumors and debates about the possible return of the Caliphate continue to surface, especially during times of crisis or upheaval. Some see it as a lost golden age, while others view it as an outdated relic best left in the past. In modern Turkey, the legacy of Ataturk's reforms remains a source of fierce debate. Some celebrate the country's secular identity and its achievements in education, science, and women's rights. Others argued that the rapid break with tradition left deep wounds, creating a sense of rootlessness and cultural amnesia. Some politicians have even hinted at reviving aspects of the Ottoman legacy, sparking speculation and controversy both at home and abroad. 100 years after the fall of the Caliphate, Turkey stands at a crossroads torn between the legacy of its imperial past and the demands of a rapidly changing world. The echoes of that fateful decision still shape the country's politics, culture, and identity. And as new generations look to the future, the question remains: what does it mean to be Turkish in a world where the old certainties have vanished? The search for answers continues, and the story of the Ottoman Empire's end is far from over. But as history has shown, the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected, and the debate over Turkey's true identity is one that is unlikely to fade anytime soon. Conclusion: a century later, unanswered questions. 100 years have passed since the world watched the Ottoman Caliphate dissolve into history, but the echoes of that seismic event still reverberate through Turkey and far beyond its borders. The end of the Caliphate was more than just the fall of a dynasty. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined not only a nation, but the spiritual and political landscape of the entire Muslim world. Today, as Turkey marks a century since that turning point, the questions left behind remain as urgent and unresolved as ever. For some, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire is a source of pride, a reminder of a time when Istanbul was the heart of a vast, multicultural empire, and the sultans commanded respect from Europe to Asia. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of clinging to the past, of failing to adapt to a rapidly changing world. The reforms of Ataturk, bold and often controversial, set Turkey on a new path, one that embraced secularism, modernity, and a distinct national identity. Yet, the cost of that transformation was steep: a rupture with centuries of tradition, a loss of cultural memory, and a lingering sense of dislocation for many Turks across the Muslim world. The abolition of the Caliphate left a void that has never truly been filled. For centuries, the Caliph had been a symbol of unity, a figure who could, at least in theory, bring together diverse peoples under a single banner. In the years since, countless movements and leaders have tried to revive that sense of unity, but none have succeeded in restoring the authority or legitimacy of the old caliphs. Rumors and speculation about the return of the Caliphate still surface from time to time, especially during moments of crisis or upheaval. Some see it as a lost golden age, a time when the Muslim world was united and strong. Others argue that the very idea is outdated, a relic of a world that no longer exists. In Turkey itself, the debate over identity is as fierce as ever. The country stands at a crossroads, pulled between the legacy of its imperial past and the realities of a modern, globalized world. Recent years have seen a resurgence of interest in Ottoman history, with political leaders invoking the glories of the empire and popular culture romanticizing the days of sultans and palaces. At the same time, the principles of secularism and republicanism, so central to Ataturk's vision, are being questioned and reinterpreted by new generations. The tension between past and present, tradition and progress, is woven into the very fabric of Turkish society. What does the future hold? Could the Caliphate ever return, even in a symbolic form, or has the world moved on, leaving the age of empires and sultans behind for good? There's no simple answer. What's clear is that the story of the Ottoman Empire's end is not just a tale of loss, but also one of resilience and reinvention. Turkey's journey over the past century has been marked by struggle, adaptation, and a constant search for a journey that mirrors the broader challenges faced by societies everywhere as they navigate the pressures of history and the demands of the present. As the world looks back on 100 years since the fall of the Caliphate, one thing is certain: the questions it raised are still with us, shaping debates about faith, power, and belonging. The story of Turkey is far from over, and the lessons of its past continue to inspire, challenge, and provoke. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of the Ottoman Empire is not what was lost, but the enduring spirit of a people determined to define their own destiny, no matter how uncertain the future may be. And as history has shown time and again, the past is never truly gone. It waits just beneath the surface, ready to shape the world once more when the moment is right.